On the afternoon of April 17th, 2003, 33-year-old John Parker Jr. sat at his desk in his office at J&J Parker Industries in Mrballen, Indiana. He was looking over some paperwork and hoping he would get at least a few minutes without any interruptions to finish reading it. Because in John's world, a few minutes were hard to find. John was the owner of J&J, which was a consulting company dedicated to training people to sell high-end vacuums. Now, vacuums were not glamorous, but his company was really successful, and running it was a lot of work. He was on his feet all day, managing about 25 employees and solving constant problems, and he usually did not get much quiet time to do things like paperwork. And even though John did complain about this, the truth was he actually loved being busy. He had always been a very hard worker. He'd started in the vacuum business as a door-to-door salesman, and even though everyone told him there was no money in vacuums, he'd proved them wrong. He was so good at sales that he made his first $1 million by the time he was just 30 years old. And now he had a whole company that taught other people how to be great at it too. But now, as John tried to get through the paperwork, his desk phone rang. He sighed and he picked it up, and it was his wife, Judy. She told him that their daughter had left her homework in his office when she was there just the other day, and she asked him if he could bring it home with him. Now, John was about to tell his wife that this was now the second time she had reminded him about this homework, but he stopped himself because right now things were pretty good. Things between them were solid, and so he tried to remind himself that it was not worth messing that up. So John and Judy had been married for 10 years, and she was his partner in life and in business. They had raised 4 kids together, and Judy was actually the second J in J&J Parker Industries. John knew that to everyone else they looked like a happy, successful power couple, but the truth was much more complicated, because about a year ago, Judy had an affair. And this had devastated John at the time, but he really wanted to give their marriage another shot. They'd been living in Michigan at the time, and they agreed that moving the business to Maryville, Indiana, where John was from, would be a good way to start fresh. And so far, they both felt like it had been the right call. The business was doing really well, things were looking up, and most importantly, John and Judy were actually getting along. So now, instead of getting annoyed at his wife for repeatedly asking him about the homework, he just said, sure, and that he would see her later for their date night. As soon as John hung up with Judy, he heard a knock on the door, and his office manager, Barry Jones, charged in holding more files. Barry dropped them on John's desk and said sorry, but he needed a signature. It was for the final termination paperwork for an employee John fired, whose name was Derek Hall. So a week earlier, John had made the very difficult decision to let Derek go. It wasn't personal. Derek just wasn't a good fit. He couldn't keep up with the sales quota. And John had really high standards for his employees. That's how he became a millionaire in the first place. But Derek somehow thought his firing was John's fault. And he'd actually showed up at J&J and made a scene in the parking lot saying that John had shorted him hundreds of dollars on his last paycheck. And when John tried to defuse things, Derek had physically attacked him. The police had to be called, and they separated John and Derek before it got too ugly. And John had ended up paying Derek what he wanted, since he just wanted the whole thing to be over, which was also why now he was immediately scribbling his signature on the termination paperwork and handing it back to Barry, because hopefully now he would just never have to see or speak to Derek ever again. After work, around 6 p.m., John drove home, which was about 15 minutes away from the office. And when he got inside his house, he heard Judy call down from upstairs that she'd be ready soon. So he yelled back that there was no rush, and he meant it. And this was because just over an hour earlier, his older brother David had met him at the office, and they'd gone to a buffet together. So John really wasn't hungry at all anymore. But dinner with Judy was definitely more about spending time together than actually eating, so he wasn't going to say anything about the late lunch. John made his way into the living room where his 4 kids were watching TV. It was his 17-year-old daughter, Christina, her 15-year-old brother, Daniel, and their 2 younger sisters. The older kids were going to babysit the younger ones tonight so that he and Judy could go out. But when John tried to make conversation with them, Christina and Daniel gave him the cold shoulder. Now, to any other parent, this could be interpreted perhaps as just typical teenage behavior. But to John, it was more loaded than that. So Christina and Daniel were actually his stepkids. John had been in their life since they were really little, and he considered himself to be their dad. and John had always tried to be very involved in things like coaching Daniel in baseball and going to school concerts and parent-teacher conferences. But his relationship with these kids had changed lately, and frankly, both of the kids had really begun acting out. Christina repeatedly threw parties at their house whenever he and Judy were gone, while Daniel was combative and hung out with a group of friends who were seemingly always in trouble with the law. And this had created a lot of conflict between them and John, because he was the one who tried to discipline them, while Judy sort of always played the good cop. But John knew better than to try and force them to talk to him. So when he went in there, he just kept quiet and they all watched the TV until Judy came downstairs and said she was ready to go. Hours later, just before 10 p.m., John and Judy left their dinner, got in the car, and drove back to John's office at J&J Parker Industries, which was in an office park in a secluded area. And the two of them had had a really nice dinner. However, during their meal, Christina had called and wanted to know where that homework was that John was supposed to bring home. And John, very embarrassingly, suddenly realized that despite all those reminders from Judy that he was getting so annoyed by, he had forgotten the homework at the office. So that's why they were here now, to pick up the homework on their way home. John parked the car in the lot and both of them hopped out. When they got inside the building, they found that the office manager, Barry, was still there working, which John expected. I mean, things had been busy lately with planning seminars and finding a new hire to replace Derek, and Barry was in charge of keeping it all organized. And John really didn't feel too bad that Barry was putting in so many hours. I mean, this was his job, and the company relied on him to ensure nothing major slipped through the cracks. So when Barry mentioned to John when he went inside that, he actually might be heading home soon, John said no. At the same time, John saw his wife grab the homework from his desk and then hustle out to the car, and as she disappeared, John told Barry that he was sorry, but Barry needed to stay and finish what he was doing. But then, to make up for delivering this bad news, John offered Barry his leftovers from dinner. He had basically a full meal since he had not been hungry. Barry sort of grumbled about it, but said he would take the food if he was offering, and so John nodded and went outside to grab it. Moments later, John arrived at the car, where Judy was waiting in the passenger seat. He opened up the back door, and he picked up the styrofoam to-go box. When Judy looked back at him, he told her he was going back to give the food to Barry, and she just shrugged and said, fine, then turned back around. But right at that same moment, John heard the sound of footsteps in the concrete right behind him. But before he could turn around, he heard a deafening bang. Judy heard the bang too, which was followed quickly by a second one, and she instinctively ducked down in her seat and then looked back at John just in time to see him fall hard to the ground. And before she could do or say anything, she saw a masked person in dark clothes crouch over John for just a few seconds, and then they sprinted away from the car towards the main road. Judy leapt out of the car and ran to John, yelling his name, but he just lay there on the pavement, not moving. And then she saw this huge pool of blood forming right underneath his head. With her heart racing, Judy ran to the office door and screamed at Barry to call the police. By about 10:30 that night, the parking lot at J&J Parker Industries was overrun with officers and crime scene technicians. Among them was Detective Donald Toth, who had been with the Maryville Police Department for the last 21 years. When he first got the call, dispatch had only known that there was a shooting, but when he arrived on the scene, a first responder told him that there'd actually been a fatality. 33-year-old John Parker Jr., who had been identified by two witnesses at the scene. The first responder also explained that when they got there, before they spoke to the witnesses, they had looked for John's wallet to identify him, but the wallet had not been in his pockets or in the car. And when Toth heard that, his first thought was that maybe this was a robbery. But as soon as he walked over and got a look at John, he immediately revised that theory. John was on his back behind a parked car, and the first thing Toth noticed was that he had a lot of nice jewelry on. Gold and diamond rings, a bracelet, and an expensive-looking Rolex watch. Also, this office park was not close to anything, and it just didn't feel like the kind of place a random mugger would go looking for victims. Toth wondered if the killer took the wallet just to make police believe this could be a robbery. Because the longer he looked at John's body, the more signs he saw that this was likely an efficient, planned execution. John didn't have any visible defensive wounds, And when Toth used a gloved hand to move John's head to the side, he saw a gunshot wound right behind his ear. Toth had actually been a paramedic before becoming a detective, so he knew that shot had likely killed John instantly. It also meant John had his back turned to the shooter when he died. There was an open styrofoam to-go container of food and some car keys on the ground right next to John's body, and their placement made it feel like John might have been holding them when he fell. If John had an altercation, like with a thief or somebody who killed him in the heat of the moment, the scene would be way messier. As far as Toth could tell, the killer had just walked up to John while he was busy with something at his car, aimed the gun, pulled the trigger, and then after he died, grabbed John's wallet and then left. Which also meant the killer very likely had not been at the scene long enough to leave behind much evidence. All Toth saw were just 2 shell casings, and he doubted there would be footprints or DNA. And when Toth spoke to some of the other officers at the scene, he learned they'd already done a sweep of the office park, and they'd looked in dumpsters and bushes and on the roofs of all the buildings, but they hadn't found anything, and they didn't see any cameras or surveillance in the area. So, as Toth stood in the middle of the parking lot and watched his officers continue to search the scene, he realized he was the lead on a case with virtually no forensic evidence, which might have been daunting, but he did have at least 2 witnesses. About an hour later, Toth sat down across a table from John Parker's wife, Judy, inside of an interrogation room inside the Mrballen police station. He'd learned a few things about Judy already. She'd been the one who told Barry to call the police, and she was with John when he was shot. He also knew that, as the spouse of the murder victim, she was his best suspect. Now, Toth didn't really think Judy was the actual shooter, but considering how pristine the crime scene was, he knew it was possible this was a hit, done by a professional, and Judy maybe could have hired them. But as Toth spoke to Judy, he started to waver on that theory. She couldn't stop crying, which made it hard for her to get her words out, and when she did speak, it was slow, like it was taking her a lot of effort to say anything at all. She did manage to give Toth a timeline, how she and John had gone out to dinner for their date, and then stopped over at the office after, since one of their daughters had left some homework there. She said the office manager, Barry, had been there, and that when she had gone back to the car, she knew that Barry and John were speaking. And then at some point, John, he left the building and came out to get his dinner leftovers, and at that time, she had turned away from him, and then she heard these 2 loud shots. And then when she turned back around, she saw John fall, and then also there was this figure in dark clothes who was sort of bending down on top of John, and then they ran away. However, when Judy finished telling her story about what had happened that night, all the events that led up to the shooting, something changed in her demeanor. The shakiness in her voice and all the grief that was sort of pouring out of her to this point, it vanished. And in its place, Judy became very hardened, and she looked right at Toth, and she said, "You better find the person who did this and bring them to justice." And when Toth saw this, he almost got goosebumps from it because it was such a quick departure from what had been going on. And he thought to himself, either she is a great actress and this is all a big facade and she did it or she was involved, or this is genuine. She's a grieving widow who doesn't know what to make of the fact that her husband has just been killed. At some point, Toth asked Judy if she could think of anybody who might have wanted to hurt John. And Judy appeared to think for a second, but eventually she just said no. She said that John was an incredible husband and father, and they had a great marriage that they had really worked hard on, and everybody at work respected him. But then something clearly occurred to Judy, because she frowned and said, actually, there was someone from work who didn't like John. His name was Derek, and John had fired him recently. And after the firing, Derek had come back to J&J and started a physical fight with John in the parking lot. When Toth heard that, he perked up. A disgruntled employee was definitely somebody that he should be speaking to. And Toth was speaking to the office manager, Barry Jones, right after this, and so he figured he could ask him about that incident too. Now, Toth wasn't ready to rule Judy out as a suspect, since he still needed to check her finances and talk to her friends and family about her marriage. But for now, he didn't see a reason to hold her. So he told Judy that for now, she was welcome to go home and be with her kids and grieve, and they would be in touch. Then Toth got up and he left to go to another interrogation room where Barry was waiting. The following morning, Toth walked up a flight of porch steps. He was at the home of Derek Hall, the ex-employee of J&J Parker Industries that John Parker had recently fired. Last night, Toth had spoken to John's office manager, Barry Jones, who had confirmed what John's wife Judy had said about Derek, that after he was fired, there had been this huge, ugly fight at the office between Derek and John, and Derek was the instigator. It was the only useful information Barry had given him, since he said, during the shooting, he had actually been in the bathroom, and so he hadn't heard or seen anything until he heard Judy screaming for him. But the lead on Derek was enough. And the other thing was, Barry and Judy were not the only ones who thought Derek might have killed John. Just before this, Toth also spoke to John's brother, David, who was incredibly devastated and furious about his brother's death, and David had also pointed the finger at Derek. So Toth was very eager to meet Derek, a man 3 people claimed could be a killer. Toth got to the top of the steps and knocked on the front door. And when Derek answered, Toth introduced himself and explained why he was there. Derek seemed stunned, but he immediately let Toth inside. Moments later, Toth was sitting across from Derek in the living room, and even though Derek seemed very uncomfortable and nervous, he told Toth he was actually glad the detective was there, because he really wanted to give his side of the story. Derek said that when he started working at J&J, he was given way more work than he'd expected, and when he couldn't keep up with it, he was fired. And then, John shorted him $400 on his final paycheck, so he had gone to J&J to get the money he was owed. Now, he admitted that it did lead to a physical fight, but he said they'd only pushed each other, and it ended up getting resolved, like it wasn't that big of a deal. But beyond that, Derek insisted he could not have killed John because he'd actually spent the whole evening last night at a friend's house playing video games. He gave Toth the friend's number and said, "Go ahead, call him, he'll confirm it." Toth tried not to look too disappointed as he took down this number, but if the alibi checked out, he could rule Derek out as a suspect. Now, it was possible that Derek had, actually taken a hit out on John, but to Toth, that seemed unlikely. If Derek was that upset over $400, it didn't seem likely that he would have the excess cash to pay anybody to go commit a murder. But as Toth left Derek's house and got back in his car, he decided the interview was not a total bust after all. Because talking to Derek made him realize he needed to focus more on John's business life. According to John's brother David, John got rich young and built his company very quickly. And in Toth's experience, those kinds of people often stepped on others to get to the top. The next day, Toth walked down a hallway at the precinct towards an interrogation room. He had confirmed Derek's alibi with his friend, so he had to move on to other suspects for now. Which was fine with Toth because he was about to sit down with his new prime suspect, who happened to be one of his former witnesses. It was John's office manager, Barry Jones. Yesterday, Toth had gone to the J&J Parker Industries office and made it a point to speak to every single employee about John. And he found out that John was a great boss who pushed his employees, but he worked hard himself. The employees also said that Judy was an essential part of the company, and the Parkers as a duo were well respected in the world of vacuum sales. But office gossip also said their marriage was not exactly happy, and it was sort of common knowledge that Judy was having an affair with Barry Jones. A few employees had even caught them having sex at the office. Now, neither Barry nor Judy had mentioned this the first time Toth had spoken to them, so now Toth had no idea if anything they had said to him was true. Barry could have been lying about being in the bathroom and was actually, the shooter, or he and Judy were maybe working together and they were both lying. Toth was leaning towards the second option because he'd also found out that Judy was going to get a big payday from the death of her husband. She was the beneficiary of a $1 million life insurance policy. And aside from that, John's general estate was worth around $2 million. Maybe, he thought, she and Barry wanted to take John's money and run off together. So when Toth went into the interrogation room, he intended on essentially saying that the investigation was over. They'd caught Barry in a lie, and they knew what he did. But when Toth sat down and confronted him, Barry did not act like somebody who was guilty and cornered. He was charismatic and confident, and he said the affair was total office gossip. He was just good friends with Judy, and they worked together closely. Barry said he and Judy and John were like family. In fact, he said he was living with one of Judy's cousins from Texas. Now, Toth didn't really believe what Barry was saying, But even though he kept pressing him, Barry stuck to his story. And eventually, Toth just had to let him go. Because without any evidence, it was just Barry and Judy's word against the employees. And even if they were having an affair, that was not enough to prove they also conspired to murder John. On Monday, April 21st, so 4 days after John's murder, Toth was at his desk, rereading the notes from Barry and Judy's interviews for what felt like the millionth time. He was still trying to find a concrete way to link Judy and Barry to John's murder before approaching Judy about it. But so far, other than the office rumors, he hadn't found anything, and he didn't really have any other leads, aside from learning that the shell casings found on the scene were from a .25 caliber gun. Which was useful to know, but it wasn't going to help him with his suspect list. Toth leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He'd been full speed ahead on this case since Thursday night, and he was exhausted. He was starting to consider maybe going home and getting some rest when he heard a light knock on his door. An officer poked his head in and told Toth there was somebody on line 3 with a tip, and it sounded like a good one. Toth picked up his phone, and the person on the other end of the line explained they were a police officer as well from a nearby town, and they said that they had heard about John Parker's murder on the news and realized they had some information. So about 6 months earlier, this officer had been called to a local juvenile detention facility to take a report. The staff there had done a random search on their kids and found that 2 of them had a lot of cash, over $200. Having cash was against the rules, and when the kids were asked where they got it, they said it was payment for a hit on John Parker. Now, that stunned Toth, but not nearly as much as what the officer said next. These 2 kids said the person who had arranged this hit was a former high school classmate of theirs named Daniel Hicks. And Toth couldn't believe what he was hearing, because Daniel Hicks was John's own 15-year-old stepson. Toth had really begun to think that this murder could be a professional hit, but it did not occur to him that this hit could be linked to family and also a child. Now, the officer on the phone explained that they really hadn't taken this very seriously at the time, so no one had notified John's family or spoken to Daniel about it. Which, Toth did not have to point out here, but this was a huge screw-up. But he wasn't focused on, the right and wrong of it. He was just focused on figuring out what happened. And so Toth got the names of these 2 kids with the cash from the officer, and when he hung up, he immediately sent some of his own officers to track these kids down. Then Toth put in a call to Judy. He needed to bring her son, Daniel, in for an interview, and since he was a minor, Judy was going to have to come too. Late that same night, actually after midnight, Toth was once again inside of an interrogation room with Judy. But this time, instead of answering questions herself, Judy was sitting at the back of the room, watching while her son Daniel sat at the table with Toth and a few other detectives. Toth had spoken to Judy right before this, and she had seemed genuinely shocked to hear that her child apparently asked somebody to kill John. She told Toth there had to be a mistake here, and she was happy for police to speak to Daniel directly because that would allow them to clear this all up. Toth had decided not to ask Judy about the affair with Barry at that moment because she was being very cooperative, letting them speak to her son, and he also just didn't want to upset her and have her change her mind. They also had not been able to find those 2 kids that Daniel supposedly hired, and so right now, Daniel was the only one he could speak to. And so now, watching Daniel, Toth could see he was acting like a typical young person who was in trouble. He seemed nervous, and he was blinking a lot, and he kept rearranging his hands like he wasn't really sure what to do with them. And so Toth decided his best approach was just to be direct. Maybe he could scare the truth out of Daniel. So right off the bat, he told Daniel he knew about the murder for hire, and he told him to explain himself. And to Toth's surprise, Daniel took a big breath and then said it was true. He had actually paid 2 friends some money he had saved from his allowance because he hated his stepdad. John was always on his case and yelling at him, and Daniel just wanted it to stop. But Daniel said he didn't want John to die. He was adamant that he had just asked his friends to, teach John a lesson and beat him up. Toth thought about this. It was possible that Daniel was telling the truth here, and the 2 kids in the detention center either lied or had decided on their own to kill John. But that felt a little far-fetched, because why would these kids lie to get themselves in more trouble? Toth thought it was much more likely that Daniel was the one who was lying, and Toth was not about to let Daniel go anywhere until he found out for sure. So he told Daniel and Judy that he was sorry, but they were going to have to take Daniel into custody. Then Toth called some officers in to make the arrest, and as he left the room, you could hear Judy and Daniel sounding completely shocked behind him. Now, at this point, even though Toth had been up all night and he was totally exhausted, at the same time, he actually felt far more alert than he did even in the couple days before, because now it felt like they really were, making movement on this case. And so instead of trying to get some rest back at his house, he went back to his office, poured some coffee, and kept on working. On May 15th, 2003, so almost a month after John Parker's murder, Detective Don Toth sat at his desk reading some copy for a flyer and making some last-minute changes to it. So far, it said that police were looking for information about John Parker's murder in Mrballen, and it offered a reward to anybody who came forward. Toth planned to pass these flyers out all over town tomorrow to see if the public could maybe give him a new lead. It was sort of an act of desperation, because while this case had seemed close a couple times to being wrapped up, just a few weeks ago, now it was pretty much dead. It had taken police a while, but they had finally found both of those kids from the detention center that Daniel apparently hired to, rough up his dad, who ultimately apparently killed him. And the kids admitted to meeting with Daniel and accepting the money. But it turned out there was just no way they were actually the murderers. One of them had been thousands of miles away in Las Vegas when John was killed, and the other had been in detention at a juvenile facility. And so since Toth could not prove the assassins Daniel hired had actually killed anyone, he'd had to let Daniel go. But that didn't mean Daniel was innocent here. Those two kids had said that Daniel did ask for John to be killed, not just beat up. So Daniel was lying about that. And Toth didn't think someone who wanted to kill his father had just stopped wanting to kill his dad all of a sudden. But since Toth knew Daniel was at home babysitting his younger siblings during the time of John's murder, Toth figured he'd likely gotten somebody else to do it. But Toth couldn't just keep talking to Daniel, because Judy had gotten a lawyer, and they were now not letting Toth question the family members at all anymore, which was very frustrating, since Toth wasn't done with Judy either. Out of everyone, she benefited the most from John's death because she was a beneficiary on his life insurance. And she was very likely having an affair with his office manager, Barry, and so maybe part of her motive could have been just to hide the affair from him. And then also Barry. He's potentially having this affair with Judy, John's wife. He might have a motive as well to get rid of John, to just keep this thing a secret. Also, he definitely seemed to think that John was, a pretty tough boss, and so maybe he just had had enough, and he was complicit or actively involved in getting rid of John. He was also at the scene of the crime right when it happened, and since there weren't any cameras, Toth couldn't actually confirm Barry's version of events. But at this point, Toth didn't have the evidence he needed to prove any of these suspects actually killed John or hired somebody to do it. And he also didn't have enough evidence to eliminate them and narrow down his pool further. Instead, Toth had just kept adding to it. Because as of this week, he was also considering John's brother, David, as a person of interest. A few days ago, some officers had been called to Judy's house because John's brother David had stopped by her house and gotten into a verbal fight with the family. And this was not the first time this had happened. Apparently, David had gone over there and threatened the family before. One time, he had even damaged their car. This kind of behavior could mean David was just lashing out because he was grieving, but it also could mean he was erratic and potentially violent. Plus, he had been with John on the afternoon of the murder at that buffet, and he knew that John was going to have dinner with his wife later, so he could have guessed that John would check in at the office after they were done eating, since he was a famously hard worker. Toth sighed and took a break from looking at this flyer. His brain was fried, but he felt hopeful these flyers would give him the tip he desperately needed to break this case. And so the next day, Toth and some other officers passed these flyers out. But then weeks went by with no tips. And even though Toth did eventually get a few responses to the flyers, none of them gave him any actual evidence. So over the next few months, Toth spent his days in his office, poring over files for something he missed, or maybe a witness they didn't interview, or evidence they'd maybe overlooked. But there was just nothing. And as the months turned into years, Toth had to turn to other projects. And eventually, the John Parker murder case went cold. "4 years after John's murder, on an afternoon in February of 2007, Toth arrived at work for the day and headed to his office. Now, he had not forgotten about the John Parker case, but he was not actively investigating it at this point. In fact, all his cases had been winding down because he was planning to retire in just a few months. But right before he actually got to his office door, a narcotics officer caught up to him and asked for a word. The officer explained that he knew Toth wasn't on their narcotics team, but they had a warrant out for a man involved in one of their drug investigations, and they had realized this man had some crossover with one of Toth's homicides from 2003, the John Parker case. Toth stopped in his tracks and immediately told this officer to go get him an interview. And sure enough, later that day, Toth sat down with this man who was very chatty and seemed extremely eager to talk. And the first thing this man did was explain that the person he lived with knew John Parker, and they had admitted to him that they were directly involved in his death. And when this man told Toth the name of this person, Toth couldn't believe it. He leaned back in his chair feeling both relieved and also disturbed. He was relieved because he finally knew who John Parker's killer was, and he was disturbed because this case was now way more twisted than he had ever imagined. Based on the police investigation and multiple confessions, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to John Parker on the night of April 17th, 2003. At around 10 p.m., the killer crept slowly through the shadowy parking lot at J&J Parker Industries. They were wearing a mask and dark clothes, and they were carrying a .25 caliber gun. They could see John's car by the office entrance, with Judy sitting inside of it. But she was not the killer's target. John was. And John was also near the car. He was not inside of it. He was standing right outside one of the back car doors. It was open, and he was rifling around, inside the car, looking for something. And as the killer stared at John, thinking about what they were going to do next, they thought about John, who this man was, and how controlling and selfish he was. He had made the killer's life a living hell, and now the killer was going to get retribution. So while John continued to have his back turned, the killer silently walked up right behind him. They raised their gun, aimed at the back of his head, and they fired. And it was a direct hit that hit him right behind the ear, and John fell so fast that when the killer fired a second time, they just missed. Now, the killer had never murdered anyone before, so they were shocked by what they had just done. But they were kind of jostled back into reality when they heard John's wife, Judy, yelling out and screaming. And so quick as can be, the killer grabbed John's wallet, so the police would think this was maybe a robbery gone wrong, and then they turned and sprinted off into the night. Much later that night, the killer waited at home until the person who had masterminded this whole thing arrived, and they gave them a hug and said they had done a good job. The mastermind then took the gun, John's wallet, and the clothes the killer wore during the murder, and told the killer they were disposing of them. And the killer just listened, feeling very relieved. He trusted the mastermind more than anybody else in the whole world, because, after all, she was his mother. It would turn out Judy had convinced her own 15-year-old son, Daniel, to murder his stepfather, her husband. Judy wanted to get out of her marriage with John, but she knew if she divorced him, she would have only gotten half of his estate and their business. And so with his death, she could get the whole thing. Now, she had actually already tried to kill John, just unsuccessfully. First, she had tried to poison him, but when that didn't work, she had hired a hitman herself. But that also failed. So finally, she asked Daniel to help by promising that he would get some of the money. And she had also enlisted her daughter, Christina, who was the one who found the gun to kill John with. Daniel actually tried to hire somebody else for the job, but then ultimately just did it himself and used his younger siblings for an alibi, saying he was at home babysitting. And the man who told all this to the police was Christina's husband, who she married 2 years after John's death. And once her husband gave authorities the whole story, police interrogated both Christina and Daniel, who eventually confessed. Judy was convicted of murder and sentenced to 33 years in prison, while Daniel got 23 years in prison. And Christina received 5 years for her part in the murder as well. Christina would die in 2013 from a drug overdose. Daniel was released in 2017, and Judy was released in 2022. At 12:30 a.m. on August 9, 2013, a man named Kyle Lawson was asleep in his bedroom with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, when his cell phone rang, and it woke him up. Kyle looked at the caller ID and saw that the call was coming in from his 26-year-old brother, Brandon. And so, Kyle picked it up, but before he could even say hello, his brother said he needed help. And then he launched into this big story that really sounded completely insane. He told Kyle he was currently driving north on Highway 277, which is this totally desolate 2-lane country road that runs through West Texas, and that 3 men were chasing Brandon. And on top of that, Brandon told his brother that, he's trying to get away from these men, but his truck was about to run out of gas. And so what he wanted Kyle to do was to, right now in the middle of the night, come meet him secretly to hand off a gas tank so Brandon could officially escape these 3 men. But as Kyle listened to this, he was not really actually concerned, at least in terms of Brandon being in any sort of real danger with regards to these 3 men that were chasing him. In reality, Kyle's reaction to this was just being so annoyed at Brandon. Because after hearing this story, this frantic story Brandon's telling him in the middle of the night, he was sure that really there were no 3 men, that instead his brother Brandon was just high again. And he was hallucinating. He was basically having an episode that was substance-induced. So Brandon had a history of methamphetamine use. He'd been clean for the last 6 months or so, and he'd been working on, being a better partner to his fiancée, Ladessa, and also a better father to his 4 children. But just 2 days ago, Brandon had also called Kyle, but it had been to ask Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Now, Kyle did not immediately say, "Oh, here's where you go to get drugs." Instead, he tried to tell Brandon, don't do it. You should not get high. You're clean. You're doing good. But he was pretty sure Brandon had not listened, because ever since that phone call, even though Kyle didn't give him any, resources for drugs, Brandon must have gone and gotten drugs anyways, because his behavior had just been completely crazy in general. In fact, right now, Kyle knew from having spoken to his parents earlier that the whole reason Brandon was even driving on Highway 277 right now was because he got into a big fight with his fiancée and was supposed to be going to his parents' house to chill out. He was basically going to time out for bad behavior. That's why he was out right now. Now, Kyle knew Brandon was very likely high, and so this was not going to be a good time to reason with Brandon and tell him to, just come home or just go to your parents' house because, there's no such thing as these 3 men. You're just high. He's not going to listen to that. So instead, Kyle just focused on trying to calm Brandon down because, again, Kyle is not thinking Brandon is actually in danger. He's thinking this is just a hallucination. But as Kyle tried to do that, Brandon did not calm down. He got more and more anxious, and he's continuing to talk about these 3 men that are gaining on him. And finally, Kyle just said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" But as Kyle expected, Brandon swore up and down that he was not high, and he just kept on begging Kyle to come help him fast before these men caught up to him, "Come give me the gas I need so I can escape, come on, man." At this point, Kyle felt like there was no point even talking to Brandon, and in some ways he just wanted to hang up and forget about this whole thing. This was crazy. He has his own life and his own responsibilities. He shouldn't be babysitting his younger brother. But at the same time, Kyle was very close with his brother. Even if, he resented it, he did love his brother very much. And even though he did feel like there is no imminent danger here other than maybe Brandon to himself, Kyle decided, you know what? I'm just gonna go out on Highway 277, I'm gonna find Brandon and just get him back home. So he told Brandon he'd be right there, and then he hung up. About 45 minutes later, Kyle drove north on Highway 277, along with his wife in his passenger seat and their 4-year-old son in the back. Kyle's wife had not wanted him to be out in the middle of the night dealing with his crazy brother all alone, so she'd insisted that she and their son come along. And so as Kyle drove down the road, he kept an eye out for Brandon's truck. Now, to set the scene for you, this really is like a desolate highway. There's no real traffic, and really in either direction, it's just kind of open plains and some shrubs and small trees. Like, this is a big, wide open area. It's pretty easy to see way out in front of you. And so he's got a great view, even though it's nighttime, but he can't see any vehicles. Like, there's no truck, there's nothing. Like, his brother is nowhere to be seen. But Kyle just kept on driving and kept on looking out. He was even just sort of looking out into the fields in case, his brother had veered off the road somewhere, which seemed entirely possible. But eventually, after driving for some time, way up ahead, sort of parked half on the road, half off, was a truck. Its lights were off, it's just sitting there. It's not even idling. It's clearly turned off. But as Kyle got closer, he realized it was Brandon's truck. So he had found Brandon. And so Kyle, he pulls over to the opposite side of the road, and he parks his car, and he tells his wife and his son to stay in the car, and he's gonna go talk to Brandon, who at this point Kyle is assuming is sitting in his truck, waiting for Kyle. And also keep in mind at this point, Kyle's thinking, well, there's nobody else out here. There's no 3 men chasing my brother. He's probably just sitting here, high as can be, and I'm gonna talk to him, and he's just gonna go home, and we're gonna move past this. But when Kyle walked over to the vehicle, there was nobody inside of it. Brandon's gone. And he's thinking to himself, this really doesn't make any sense, because on the ride to the truck, as they were on Highway 277, Brandon kept repeatedly calling Kyle over and over and over again, being like, come on, you gotta hurry up, you gotta get here. They're gaining on me like I'm in trouble. Bring that gasoline, you gotta get here. And now that he's here, he's finally reached, clearly, Brandon's truck. It's right here, and Brandon's gone? He's gone from his truck? He didn't tell him that on the phone. Like, where is he? What's going on here? And so Kyle, he's like looking under the vehicle. He's searching the vehicle now for his brother, which is totally crazy. Like, what's his brother doing here? But as he's searching the vehicle for his brother and looking around the area for his brother, Kyle's phone rings, and it's Brandon. And so Kyle, who at this point is feeling really annoyed, he answers the phone and he's like, Brandon, where are you? And Brandon goes, bro, I'm right here. And Kyle's like, no, you're not. Like, I don't see you. There's no one here. Your truck is here. You're not here. But just then, Kyle looked out and there was a car coming towards him. So he saw the headlights and he realized it was a cop car. And so he's on the phone with Brandon. He's looking out at this cop car that's coming up this road towards him and clearly slowing down. Like the police officer is going to stop and talk to Kyle, presumably. And so as this cop car is coming in and slowing down right in front of him, Brandon on the phone says to Kyle, run away from that cop. Now think about this. That meant Brandon had to be somewhere nearby because he can clearly see the cop car approaching Kyle. He's watching the scene. Even though Kyle has not found his brother, Brandon is clearly actually nearby. But Kyle, he's sort of quickly interpreting this and he's thinking, like, where is Brandon? Because he's looking out and it's just open fields in either direction on either side of this highway. It's like this barren wasteland out in the middle of Texas. Like, where is he hiding? There's nowhere to hide. There's a couple of shrubs and really small trees sort of off in the distance, but like there's really nowhere to hide. So where is Brandon? And Kyle, he's just feeling furious at this point. Confused, but furious. It's like, what are you doing, Brandon? Like, he knew the reason Brandon wanted Kyle to run also is because Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest that had to do with a drug charge. And so he's just protecting himself, like, don't get involved with the police, like, keep me out of it. And it's like, Kyle, he's already out here in the middle of the night doing this crap for his brother who's completely off his rocker. Like, he was so annoyed, but again, it's like, what does he even do? He has no idea where Brandon is. And so Kyle, he was about to say something to Brandon to demand, where are you? Come out here. But Brandon hung up. Now, by this point, the police officer had arrived on scene. He had parked his car and he walked over to Kyle, who now is standing right next to his brother's vehicle. He's put his phone back in his pocket. And the officer, when he got close enough, he introduced himself as Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Department, and he told Kyle that he was responding to a 911 call from a trucker about a stranded driver on the road. And so he asked Kyle if maybe that was him. Is this your truck? Are you the stranded driver? Pointing to Brandon's truck. But Kyle said no, it was not his. It belonged to his brother. But despite how much he really wished he could say the truth, he he wanted to protect his brother. So he couldn't tell the deputy that, well, the reason my brother left his car here is because he's probably high on meth and he's somewhere nearby hiding. And also he has a warrant out for his arrest. So instead, Kyle said, well, I think he went off to get some gas because he called me and he said he had run out of gas, so he parked his car here. So he probably has walked on and I just got here. Is it okay with you if I get back in the car with my wife and son and just drive up and down the road here to find Brandon? Because I'm sure he's fine, but he called me to help get him gas. So do you mind if I do that? And surprisingly, the deputy was like, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. And so Kyle, he got right back into his car with his wife and his son, and he did fire up his car and he drove farther down the highway. And as he did, he kept looking over his shoulder to see what the cop was gonna do. And the cop was just still parked next to Brandon's car. And eventually, when Kyle drove far enough that he knew the cop couldn't see him anymore, he pulled over to the side of the road and he began really angrily calling his brother over and over and over again to get him back on the phone. But Brandon never answered the calls. And so at this point, Kyle has no idea what's going on with Brandon. I mean, he didn't before, but now especially, he's out of contact with his brother. And so Kyle and his family would sit there for a little bit longer, like continuing to try to get in touch with Brandon, but to no end. And eventually, Kyle's 4-year-old son began crying and complaining because it's so late and he's tired. And Kyle's wife is tired, it's 2 a.m. And Kyle, he's just so over it. He's like, you know what? Brandon is an adult. I tried to come out here and get him out of this mess, but if he doesn't want to be in touch with me and he wants to hide off the side of the highway, that's on him. I'm taking my family and I'm going home. And so that's what he did. He turned around, he drove right back the way he came, and he actually passed by his brother's truck that was still there, so Brandon clearly is still in hiding. And standing next to his brother's truck is still Deputy Neil. He presumably was waiting for Brandon to show back up. He drove right past them, he went back to his home, and they went to bed. And he figured, you know what, tomorrow I will likely hear from Brandon and he'll tell me some crazy story explaining what really happened, but you know what, whatever, that's on him. Not long after Kyle had driven past Deputy Neil on his way back home, Neil decided, you know what, I'm not just gonna sit here all night waiting for Brandon. He had searched Brandon's truck and there was nothing concerning inside of it. There was, no phone, no wallet, no keys, things that people would not leave behind if they ran out of gas and decided to go walk to get gas. So it seemed very much like that is what happened. Brandon had pulled his car over, gotten out, and begun the walk. And then his brother showed up and the whole thing was playing out here. And so Neil figured, okay, well, I have other calls to go to. It doesn't seem like this is a huge emergency. And so he just reached inside the truck, he turned on the hazard lights, then he locked all the doors and shut them. And then he got in his own vehicle and he took off because again, he had other calls to attend to that night. The next morning around 8 a.m., Deputy Neil was back out on Highway 277 just to make sure Brandon had eventually come back and claimed his truck. But no, the truck was still sitting there, hazards on. Now, at this point, Deputy Neil was starting to get a bit concerned about Brandon because, he's out on foot, walking to get gas for his truck. And even though it seemed like the risk was sort of low for him, it is possible something could have happened to him. And that's why he had not come back to his truck. Maybe he was hit by a car or, got lost or something. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Or, maybe Brandon decided not to claim his truck yet. Maybe he just went home and he's gonna get it later. But regardless, it just seemed like Neil really had to go follow up personally with Brandon just to make sure he was okay. And so Neil drove back to the sheriff's department to see if he could find the contact information for Brandon. But when he walked in the door, he didn't have any time to do any digging because another employee told him that while he was out, the department had gotten a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa. And Ledessa had given them a very different story than the one Brandon's brother, Kyle, had told Neil the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past few days. And last night, so on the night that this whole truck thing happened, Brandon was supposed to be on his way to his parents' house to cool off from the fight he was having with Ledessa. But he never arrived at his parents' house, and he never came back to Ledessa's house. And so Brandon was totally unaccounted for. And on top of that, nobody could get in touch with Brandon. They were calling and texting him, no response. After hearing this, Deputy Neil was surprised and also pretty angry because clearly Brandon's brother Kyle had acted like everything was totally fine the night before, but that had to have been a lie, because Ledessa is saying this totally different story. And so the first thing Neil did is he went and spoke to Kyle and also to the rest of Brandon's family to get the story straight here. And very quickly, it became clear to Deputy Neal that any omissions or even lies about what had happened exactly on the night that Kyle went missing were not because the family was hiding something. I mean, they were kind of trying to protect Brandon, but it was because they didn't understand how serious this situation really was. And so now that Brandon really was missing and nobody knew what happened to him, the family was very forthright that they really didn't know what had happened to him, and that yes, maybe he was on drugs, we don't know, but he really is missing and you gotta go look for him. And so that's what Neal did. Over the next 4 days, there was this huge search that Neal led all around Highway 277, where the center of the search was where Brandon's truck had been found. But despite using canines and helicopters and these huge search teams, some of which had thermal cameras which would allow you to see body heat, despite covering this vast area all around where Brandon clearly had been, there was absolutely no sign of him. And they also spoke to the homeowners and the property owners sort of roughly in the area to see if maybe they had seen something strange, maybe seen Brandon or those 3 men that apparently had been chasing him on the night he went missing, but nobody had seen anything. And so basically, Brandon was definitely not here. And there was no sign he had been here other than his truck. That was it. And so Deputy Neal and the rest of the authorities who were involved in this search ultimately came to the conclusion that based on the fact that Brandon had clearly been fighting with his fiancée, that he had an active warrant out for his arrest, and that he had not been seen in days and there was no sign of him anywhere, nothing, that what must have happened here is Brandon fled. That he's not here because he chose not to be here, that he was never in any danger, he fled the area, and looking here is going to do nothing. We basically have to wait for Brandon to show up at some point. And so for the most part, this seemed like a pretty open and shut case, until Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, came into the station in person with a bombshell. On August 13th, 2013, so 4 days after Brandon went missing, this is right around the time the search has been called off, the officer on duty at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa. And Ledessa looked extremely upset. And she said that she'd gotten so worried about Brandon that she'd started searching through their cell phone records. And she had found something really concerning. She pulled out a piece of paper and she handed it to the officer, and she pointed at a specific section. And this officer, he realized quickly that this was a printed out copy of Brandon's call logs. And what Ledessa was pointing to was a call that Brandon had made at 12:50 a.m. on the night he disappeared. In between a flurry of calls to Kyle and also to Kyle's wife, Brandon had also placed a call to 911. Ledessa told the officer that the fact that Brandon himself had called 911 actually terrified her, because Brandon would have done practically anything to avoid the police. He was terrified of the police. In fact, she knew from talking to Kyle that Brandon had even suggested to him that he should run from the police on the night he went missing when he saw the cop approaching him. And so she said, look, he would only ever call the police if he truly had to. But she's like, why then, after calling the police, did he presumably run away? It just doesn't make any sense. And all of this came as a total surprise to this officer and to the sheriff's department. Because until this moment, the belief had been that a trucker had called 911 about a stranded driver, and that was how Deputy Neal got involved, and really this whole thing started. But nobody knew there had also been this other 911 call from Brandon himself. The 911 dispatch in the area was tiny, underfunded, and understaffed. And at some point, someone must have just dropped the ball when it came to informing the sheriff's department about Brandon's 911 call, because they really didn't know about it. But now that they did, they needed to hear that call for themselves. The sheriff's department would contact that 911 dispatch, and they would send them an audio recording of Brandon's call. And when they listened to it, they were shocked. Because one, Brandon 100% sounded like he was in imminent danger. This was not like a low-stakes call from a stranded driver. This was someone who thought they were in real peril here. And then two, if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of somebody else's voice in the background on Brandon's side of the call shortly before it cuts out.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. It's like we're just pushing some guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chasing to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
Got the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? Hello? Hello?
And so at this point, authorities are thinking, okay, this doesn't necessarily seem like this is just a disappearance. This might be a murder. I mean, they didn't have a body, but the idea that there's another voice and he's talking about being chased through the woods and there's these men coming after him, I mean, this audio recording gave a lot of legitimacy to that. And so the search, which had just ended, was quickly resumed and expanded dramatically. And for the next year, with all these additional resources being poured in, there was this massive effort to find Brandon Lawson. But they didn't find him. There was no other sign of him. He was just completely gone. They looked everywhere around that highway 277, all over the place near where his truck was. There was no evidence. He was just gone. And so ultimately, Brandon's case went cold. And for the most part, authorities just kind of moved on. But Brandon's family did not move on. His fiancée, Ledessa, would go on to hire 2 private detectives, and they would both conduct these big searches multiple times over around the area where Brandon left his truck and also across the state. But they too also just came up empty. And as the years passed by without answers, Brandon's disappearance captured more people's attention, and it started being featured on TV shows and podcasts. People had all kinds of theories about what had happened. You know, maybe Brandon really was just high and hallucinating, and he wandered off somewhere and got attacked by wild animals. Or maybe he really was being chased by these 3 men, and they kidnapped or killed him, and maybe that voice you hear on the recording was one of those 3 men. Or maybe he really had just fled the area on purpose, like the sheriff's department originally thought. Nobody really knew. And so for 9 years, Brandon's case was full of questions and 0 answers. But then, in January of 2022, a small group of volunteers went out to Highway 277 to the area where Brandon had disappeared, which had been searched so many times over. They, this small group of volunteers, would make the biggest breakthrough in Brandon's case in nearly a decade. While they were combing through this field off the side of the highway, again, a field that had been searched numerous times by hundreds and hundreds of people, these volunteers came across an old pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white shoes. They called the sheriff's department, and very quickly, a team of deputies arrived and cordoned off the area, and they continued the search. And in that same field, not far from the shorts and the shoes, they found a fragment of a human skull. And DNA testing confirmed the skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. Now, you would think that finding some of Brandon's remains would answer at least some of the questions about his disappearance, but actually, it just made the whole thing more baffling, because the area where Brandon's skull was found was right near his truck. It had been searched so many times. There were thermal cameras and canines and helicopters and hundreds of searchers, and nobody found it? Remember, off the side of the highway, this is not some thick forest. It is like this huge, flat field in West Texas with nothing but grass and short cactus plants and scattered trees. Like, this is an easy place to find stuff. Yet this skull fragment was not found, nor were the shorts or the shoes. It just seems so improbable. So where does that leave us? Well, we basically have 2 options here. Option 1 is, despite the enormous manpower, the helicopters, canine units, the thermal cameras that were used, the hundreds of volunteers and searchers that combed this area for years, either they just didn't see the grown man in bright white sneakers who was in this barren strip of West Texas where it's easy to see anything, they just didn't see him. So that's option 1. Or 2, he wasn't there. Brandon was not in the search area when they were looking for him. He was somewhere else. But if you believe option 2, the question becomes, well, where was Brandon? Where was he? Why did he call 911 and then run away and go somewhere else? Why? Where was he? And then also, even if you answer that, how did his skull fragment and his clothes wind up back in the search area 9 years later? It is one of the most profound mysteries on the internet, and to this day, we still don't have a good answer.